Hello and welcome. My name is John Devlin, and this is episode 3 of our new digital series, Monday Evenings with the Maestro. This will be the second to last episode on Beethoven's 7th Symphony, where next week we will analyze the 4th movement, and then we're excited to announce that we're going to change our format a bit. We're going to welcome in some cultural leaders to discuss the significance of the symphony and of the music we play. We're going to hear from next year's guest artists about who they are as people and the music that they're going to bring to Wheeling. And we're even going to start providing some musical content that involves our very own players from the Wheeling Symphony Orchestra. So we can't wait for what the future of this series holds. But for now, let's dive into Movement 3 of Beethoven's 7th Symphony. All right, and as always, the way I like to begin the lecture portion of the evening is by setting out our goals for the session. Today, we have 4. The first is Get Your Dance On. The third movement of most symphonies, and this one is no exception, is what we call a dance movement. We're going to talk about what that means, why it's the case that that is typical for a symphony, and then look at a few examples from across Beethoven's symphonic output. Next, the dance movement isn't just called a scherzo or a minuet. It's called scherzo or minuet and trio. Why is it called a trio? What does that mean exactly? And what are the influences that have led to the trio being part of the symphony? Now, if you joined us for last week, the next goal is going to look a little bit familiar, as the scherzo in today's symphonic movement is, in reality, an A-B-A-B-A structure. So a 5-part structure with a lot of repetition. However, we're going to discuss what's a little bit different about this version of the A-B-A-B-A form, and Beethoven, ever the jokester, gives us a little bit of a fake out at the end. And then, as we like to do to end things, we always listen to the movement, and I'll give us a little bit of a guided commentary as we roll through the music. So let's dive on into area number 1, Get Your Dance On. Now, in a typical symphony, we're going to have 4 movements. The first of which is going to be sonata form. We talked about this in episode 1, where you have the components of the structure that look like this: a slow introduction, an exposition that has theme 1, transition into theme 2, and some closing material that will usually be repeated, the development, the recapitulation, and the coda. A second movement, as we looked at last week, will typically be one of these 3 forms: theme and variations, where a musical theme is stated at the beginning, and the rest of the movement is a spinning out of different ideas based on that original theme. It can also be something called developing variations, where the music experiences a more organic, less repetitive development of an initially stated theme. Or sonata form again, but almost always in a slow tempo. Next, akin to the movement we'll look to tonight, will be, again, a dance movement. A minuet would be the typical dance movement format for composers like Haydn and Mozart. And Beethoven, being aware of this history, will include a minuet in 2 of his symphonies. And then he produces this tremendous innovation called the scherzo. Scherzo literally means musical joke. And part of that ideology is that the minuet would be played at a tempo more often than not that could be danced to. It was an elegant, formatted dance that the noble classes in Europe at the time would be familiar with, and they would expect the music to be played as a minuet to be able to be danced to. A scherzo, although it would still have almost always 3 beats in a measure, typical of a waltz or minuet dancing, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, done. So for example, be da da dum, bum bum, ba dum, ba dee da dee dum, bum bum, bum bum. A waltz we're all familiar with. Here, the scherzo will be so fast that the 3 beats are going by so quickly that a conductor in my shoes wouldn't even be able to conduct each of those beats. We actually conduct only 1 beat per bar, the first beat, and there are 3 internal subdivisions to that beat, resulting in the scherzo. So again, it's a musical joke because it goes by so fast that no one could ever dance to it, but it's put in the 3rd position of a dance movement, thwarting the expectations of the audience. The final movement would be something called a rondo, where we will look towards this for next week's session, because the final movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is in fact a rondo, or it can be a sonata form. In a quick summary, a rondo has a theme that is an A theme that returns again and again and again, marking the different sections of the rondo. And between those main theme statements are things called episodes, where the composer can go any number of directions. So let's look about more in detail in this transition from a minuet to a scherzo. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there was a tradition of court music where the noble and royal classes in Europe at this time held dances. And the most famous, of course, settings of these is in Vienna, a place that Beethoven called home for much of his life. And even here in Wheeling, we have a tribute to this style of event every single year. Now, these dances were necessary because, think about it, an orchestra needed to be the band at every occasion of note in this period of time. There was no DJ and there was no pop music band to have. So they provided not only entertainment, but the music by which everyone would have done their dancing and merrymaking throughout an evening. So how does this make its way into a symphony? Well, composers, especially at the beginning of symphony writing, weren't going to reinvent the wheel. It was a collection of, probably usually 4 movements of music, all of which would be familiar in some way to its audience. What better way at a time when attention might be beginning to lag after the great opening movement and a slow movement than to provide an upbeat dance style movement, often which it would be familiar to the listeners, both in style and maybe even specific musical content. It was a way to capture people, and it was a way to give a familiar triple feel to people in the middle of a set of movements that more often than not would have a heavy emphasis on a duple feel, either 2 beats per bar or 4. So we already mentioned a little bit about what the difference is between a minuet and a scherzo, but what is the path of this transition? As I mentioned, Beethoven is that torchbearer. He thinks it's a little silly, maybe outdated, for a waltz or a minuet to appear in the middle of a symphony, because the narrative that he's trying to tell his audiences during these great symphonic works that are so individualized and unique doesn't fit the format. There's no need for an antiquated style of dance music. So he takes the format of the 3 beat per bar music, infuses it with an incredible amount of speed, energy, and contrast, and ends up at the scherzo, a pathway which almost every other symphonic composer after him followed. As I mentioned, the scherzo and the waltz and the minuet, no matter which format the dance movement took, would have a B section called a trio. But you notice I've titled this slide A Trio of Many. Why is it called a trio if it's an orchestra piece? And of course, more often than not, there are going to be more than 3 people playing. Well, originally in the dance music that would be played in the courts, it actually would be played by 3 people. The string section would often lay out, and you typically have a combination of instruments like 2 oboes and 1 bassoon play the contrasting trio movement. This would give, frankly, the string players a little break, but it would also elicit a sort of rustic, perhaps pastoral sense to the music. That was a nice contrast to the more active, energetic style of dance in the minuet or the scherzo. So what purpose does it play? The trio provides, again, contrast. The same way in a sonata form movement, the second theme in the exposition and the recapitulation will typically be a little more relaxed, slower, have a slightly more linear feel than perhaps a more aggressive first theme. Here, it provides us a respite, and the dance steps that the people would expect to take place during this type of music would change and reflect this. I'm a huge Star Wars fan / nerd, and I know that some of the other people involved in the Wheeling Symphony are as well. And so I made a little joke here about a non-Star Wars drone. If you look to the score for this music, we're going to go over to the trio section here, which starts in this area, assai, meno, presto. Now, what is a musical drone? A musical drone is a is an idea, usually just one note, that persists no matter what changes the music above or below it are experiencing. And so you look at this here. At the beginning, you see the first violin and the second violin play the note A, which is the dominant note in this, you can see, D major section of music. Look how long this persists. This A lasts all the way through this system of music. This G sharp is what we call an ornament, but let's just, for the sake of the argument here, continue the idea of this A all the way through. Follow my cursor up to the right side of the screen here. It continues and continues and continues and continues and continues and continues all the way to the next set of pages. It continues, it continues, it continues, it continues. And then even though the A is shifted out of from this voice here, you can see it even drops to the bass. And the bass, and the bass, and the bass, and the bass. And here we have more of this idea as it gets passed to the horn. The only time this amends is when we get to this significant moment right here in the transition back to the scherzo theme. And we'll talk about that as we do our listening. But one of the indicative kind of elements that you would expect in a trio is that style of drone. And Beethoven, again, ever the jokester, takes this to the most extreme degree, where the entire trio section of this symphonic movement has a drone the whole time. Why a drone? Because the dance idea from the influences of this music go all the way back to the beginnings of instrumental performance in Europe, where you would have an instrument maybe like a bagpipe or some sort of reed instrument that's played through air pressure, that is played even if there isn't a melody instrument, while folk style dancing would take place in the countryside. So that style of drone appearing in the symphony is evocative of that earliest type of dance music. All right, on to the specific elements of the scherzo that we are going to be looking at today from Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, the third movement. So what is the overall form? Again, as we addressed in the overview, it's A, B, A, B, A. In this case, scherzo, trio, scherzo, trio, scherzo, forming the A, B, A, B, A. And then there's a very, very short coda, so short that we actually use a diminutive, codetta, to describe it, which is Beethoven's joking way of leaping towards an unexpected ending. So what is this unexpected ending fake out? As I mentioned, we have 5 core sections in this music. Scherzo, trio, scherzo, trio, scherzo. But then after you hear the scherzo for that third time, what happens? Well, Beethoven pulls a joke on us. You can see here, he even labels it as coda on the bottom left of the screen. Now, this bar line here, where it says assai, meno, presto, we get the opening bars almost exactly how we would expect of a third trio section, starting in a major key, but then we know something is amiss. We're about to have the a blindfold pulled over our eyes by this minor version, which is something that none of the preceding sections had. Now, frankly, the audience has already heard the scherzo 3 times and the rather long and at least at the beginning, very uneventful trio twice. I think Beethoven knew that the audience would not want to hear the trio a third time, but he makes them think that that's what's going to happen. And he, using that expectation, lulls you into a sense of boredom, frankly. Then all of a sudden your ears perk up when you hear this. And then zum, bum, beam, presto. He drives us to the end of the movement. So just seconds after you thought that you were in for a third trio, we zip out of the movement at the fastest tempo we've had so far, especially in contrast to the expected slower tempo of this trio section. Assai, meno, presto, very much less quickly. So Beethoven, again, is, I think, at his very, very best as a composer here, taking the expectations of an educated audience and giving them a joke within a scherzo movement, which is in and of itself a joke. And that structural listening idea that I keep saying is so important to what we do as listeners and the things that I'm trying to communicate to you in these lectures. If you understand that the third trio is not something that would ever be expected to happen, when you hear the beginning germ of that, as Beethoven just gave us, you would say, what is he doing? And then you would hear the minor version and go, I now have no idea what's happening. And then the movement ends. So that structural listening allows Beethoven to play a joke on you. And if you're in on the joke because you know the expectation, it's going to be more fun to listen to this symphony. And the last point I want to make on the third movement overall is the significance of its key, F major. Can you remember what key overall the symphony's in? If you heard our other lectures, that's right. It was A major. A major has 3 sharps. F major has 1 flat. We would call that a distant key. Very few notes are shared by F major and A major. So this is going to feel like quite a leap, both musically and to our ears. So I thought that instead of just telling you how significant this change of key is from A major to F major, I would show you. So let's look at Beethoven's entire symphonic output, 9 symphonies, and how very dynamic this change in the 7th symphony is, in fact. So in the 1st symphony, the main key of the piece as a whole is C major, and he writes a C major 3rd movement, in fact, not making that leap to a scherzo yet. He writes that movement as a minuet. The leap to the scherzo is made in the 2nd symphony, but you can still see the main key and the scherzo key are the same. 3rd symphony, the same, eroica. 4th symphony, the same. 5th symphony, the same. And you can see here I labeled that the trio is in C major because he does change the key of the trio in 3 of the symphonies, here, here, and here. But it makes sense that if you're in a minor key, you may change to a major key for your trio, because again, it's that more pastoral, relaxed influence. The minor feeling would disrupt that. So in the 6th symphony, similarly, F major, F major. Now, he changes both expectations here. Not only is the key of the scherzo in the movement we're about to listen to very distant from the predominant key of the piece, but he also changes the trio, not to a related key, again, of the body of the scherzo, but to a much more closely related key of A major. But again, 2 foreign keys exist in this movement, and you can see that's unlike anything Beethoven does in any of his other symphonies. To complete the picture, the F major scherzo in the 8th symphony. The 8th symphony is a little bit of a reversion in some ways for Beethoven. He returns to a more classical format and thus uses a minuet label, even though that movement still has a lot of traits that you would consider scherzo-like. And then the famous 9th symphony, he plays more tricks on us. Yes, it ends, the movement is in D minor, the same as the overall key for the piece, the trio being in D major, not unexpected. But the major thing that he does to thwart expectation in the 9th symphony is that this scherzo movement completely unexpectedly finds itself in the 2nd place within the symphony structure rather than the expected 3rd. So the fast movement is in the 2nd place. The slow movement of the Beethoven 9th Symphony is in the 3rd movement. Another famous symphony that comes to mind that has that tendency is Shostakovich's 5th Symphony, my favorite symphony, that also has the scherzo in the 2nd position and the slow movement in the 3rd. But I would say that you're looking at something like 1% of all symphonies make that change. No surprise that Beethoven is one of the first to do so, given the imaginative nature of his compositional mind. All right, so that's a lot of good information to put us in the context to listen to the movement. I look forward to diving into that next with you as we look at the score and also guide our way through the listening to a fantastic recording by the Pittsburgh Symphony. All right, well, I'm excited to begin our listening session. And we're beginning here on the right side of your screen where it says Presto, which is the beginning of the 3rd movement, the scherzo. So you're going to see that we have a theme established. This will come back again and again and again. This is our main material. And you can see while the strings play a supportive role, the main ear draw of the theme is here in the flutes and the bassoons. Let's give it a listen, and you'll notice it's repeated here, which is indicated by these double dots. And when the double dots in the score don't have a pair listed somewhere else in the music, it means go back to the beginning. So we'll listen to this twice through and get a sense of the main material of our movement. This is the Pittsburgh Symphony with their music director, Manfred Honeck. So you can see that unlike in previous movements, the first and the second, this music is flying by very, very quickly because each of those beats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, is a whole bar of music. So for example, the music that starts here and ends here, all of these notes takes place in half of a second or less. So as we go through, really use my pointer to keep track of where you are, because my encouragement to you again is if you're a novice at the score reading, please take a moment and go back. And if you didn't see last week's session, see my kind of primer on score reading to figure out how the arrangement of the music on the page is laid out. But then today, connect where my mouse is with the visual representation of the music and try to connect the sound to what you're seeing. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next page. See another repeat sign here because Beethoven is using a typical scherzo format here where many of the big sections are repeated. We're going to hear a very tumultuous transition as the strings pass off these accented gestures up through their layers, and then the flute and clarinet have a kind of small contrasting theme, initially soft and then suddenly, surprisingly indicated here by the two P's, even softer. The strings will reflect that gesture, and then Beethoven surprises us right here in the music. Two F's, very loud, one little surprise gesture, and then the flute takes over where the clarinet left off, the oboe takes over where the clarinet's left off and pairs with the flute to play, in essence, a repeat of this music, but at a different key level. And then that surprise happens again, and then we go on a little journey as the theme is developed here. So now we're going to, again, starting here, the music is going to fly by very quickly. See if you can connect this kind of upbeat, ebullient music with my cursor as we go by the second, what we call strain or second phrase of our scherzo A section. Surprise. Oboes take over from the clarinets. Surprise number 2. Now, the oboe and bassoon play games. All right, now we've reached a critical structural point here where the entire orchestra is ready to go. Two F's, very loud. The horns, the trumpets, the timpani have joined, and we're going to have another version of that initial theme. And then Beethoven does what's called inversion. The theme that you can see here, see how in the violins it goes high to low? Well, now the winds, flute, and oboe are going to reverse that direction and go low to high. So it will feel familiar, but Beethoven is starting to manipulate the material, much like you would do in the development section if we were in sonata form. So we've arrived here, and let's keep going. Upward. Okay, so we just went through another section of music where we heard this inversion, and now Beethoven is giving us little clips of the material that he had imagined at the beginning of the movement, interjected by these woodwind punctuation marks, leading us into a clear and obvious ending to the scherzo. Remember back here by a page where we started with ba-ba-da, 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 the strings passing along those accented gestures? Well, we're going to realize that that is a marker of Beethoven's during this movement. And again, we have something similar. If you look down here on the bottom right, again, the bass is ba-ba-da, 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 ba-ba-da. That marker comes back. We are then thrown into this music. And let's take a moment to talk about this, because if you haven't seen much music in a written score format, you might not have seen this before. What we have here is a first indicated by the 1 with a period and a second indicated by the 2 with a period ending. And what this means is that the first time you play this music, you play the music contained under the first bracket, the first ending. But then you remember those 2 dots we talked about? We're going to repeat this section, but the second time you skip this music, and you guessed it, we go to the second ending. Now, the first and second endings here are very similar. The only difference is, in fact, this diminuendo marking here, which means get gradually softer. We're transitioning into the trio section, which is more pastoral, and thus it makes sense to have a softer dynamic to begin it. However, in some pieces, a first and second ending can be wildly different, much longer than 4 bars, and is really what I would call a notational convenience for the publisher and the composer rather than a necessity. But here, this is the most logical way for this to be written out. So what we're going to do is listen again, starting down here to this transition that leads us into this long sustained chord with no diminuendo. And then we will repeat and hear this second half of the scherzo proper A material. And then we'll take another pause as we get to the trio section and discuss what we're about to hear there. So starting down here, let's go live again. Now we're back here, hearing this for the second time. Surprise. One more surprise. Remember those surprises. Oboe and bassoon. Flute. Strings cascade. Full orchestra arrives. Inversion. Transition. So we've looked at a lot of measures of music already, but what you may have noticed is that it's gone by very quickly. I'm looking down at my timer here, and we've only listened to 2 minutes and 16 seconds total of music. So that's part of the joy of these scherzo movements, is that they go by so quickly because of their fast tempo, that we can hear a lot of musical ideas in a very short amount of time. So let's go to our second big section, where, if you'll remember back to our lecture component, we change keys. And again, we're going from F major to begin with a very unexpected key, to D major, another foreign key to the home key, which is here F major. You can see we change here from 1 flat, B flat, as indicated by the flat sign on the B ledger line there. And then coming down to here, we have 2 sharps. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in D major. Assai meno presto, very much slower. And you can see we get a tempo marking. So remember we talked about that idea of this being a trio and why it was called a trio? Well, Beethoven does pay homage to its lineage by having clarinets, bassoons, and horns for this whole first section maintain the melodic interest. So even though, yes, it's 2 clarinets and 2 bassoons and 2 horns, over this, remember we talked about this pedal that's going to keep that A firmly in our ear the entire time. We're still in essence having 3 instrument groups play the theme from the trio, which is a nod by Beethoven again to its namesake. So I want you to listen as we go here to the kind of pastoral, folk-like feeling. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dee-da-pa-pum. Now, because this slower tempo actually makes it feel like this could be danced to. Imagine a farmer's wedding or something like that. But the other thing I want you to pay attention to as we go through is listen to how the violin line kind of acts as an earworm. Sometimes A, the note that they're both sustaining, a high A and a low A, first violin, second violins, sometimes it works with the harmony above, but other times it doesn't. And it serves as a little bit of an agitator, but a reminder of where this music is eventually going to go. So let's give a listen to our trio section. Notice the change of key, the pared down texture, the slower tempo marking, and this pedal. Here we go. Now, similar music, but we add the oboes, and the flutes act as a responder. So now we've reached the second strain of the trio. Now the flute and joins the rest of the group, serving as now a lead line, whereas here you can see the flutes, you have all the winds playing on one beat, and then the next beat, the flutes play by themselves, they join. But even more interesting is down here in the horns. Listen to this. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. You're going to hear this kind of hypnotic gesture by the second horn player the whole time. And put that into your ear, because there's going to be a payoff to this that we're going to hear in just a few moments. So this is the second strain of the trio. Similar music, now led by the flute, but let this infuse, this weird horn line underneath, infuse your hearing as well. Hear it? Ba-da-dum. Remember I said there would be a payoff? Well, here it is. The wind stopped. You see this material up here? They're all playing their nice melody. Boom, Beethoven ends it. And now all that's left is that crazy, hypnotic second horn line. But instead of functioning as it does here, you can see it nicely falls in a pattern. You can even see it visually, bar by bar. Now Beethoven does what's called a hemiola. He infuses something that's going to take 2 beats of time. You can see da-dum, oops, excuse me, da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. And instead of having it be every third beat, it happens every second beat. It's the same music we hear in Jaws. And he, by truncating the length of time that it repeats, moving from 3 beats to 2 beats, we get this sense of displacement. So instead of da-dum, ba-dum, we get da-dum, dee-dum, 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 and it does not align with the beats. So you can hear how unsettling this is to the music, which then recaptures itself here, and the full orchestra, in a very regal, very royal way, recaptures the energy here. So you're going to hear how this happens. We're going to let it play, and then you can see the section gets repeated. We'll listen to it once more through with all of these things in mind. But just look how beautiful it is that Beethoven back here slips in this new element. We wonder why. And of course, because he's such a great composer, there's a direct payoff to this surprise element. Here we go. So the pedal is now here in the trumpets and the timpani. Now we repeat this section again. horn asserts itself. And it's a disruptor. So the rest of the orchestra says, no way. And here we are back home. Again, here that sustained, it started here in the violins. They pass it off to the trumpets and timpani, just for this section. Okay. Now, in my mind, comes the most beautiful music of the whole movement. And if you are a huge Monday Evening with the Maestro fan, you'll remember back in the first movement, in the recapitulation, Beethoven added some new music that I told you referenced a spot in the third movement that I would talk about this week. So this is that spot that I referenced as, again, having some of the most beautiful music of the movement, where similar to that spot in the first movement where we had the movement of string chords bar by bar, 6 bars, and absolutely beautiful. Here, Beethoven uses a 2-bar chord structure, 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars. Some of the most gorgeously simple music you can imagine. It sounds like we're at church. He then repeats the beginning 2 chords here and here. So these 4 bars are the same as these 4 bars. But then look at this. He sneaks in. Remember, we've had this A pedal forever. Well, no different here. We have an A pedal in the violas. But what does he do? Oh my goodness. This note moves up to a B flat, and this note moves down to a C natural, creating what we would call a C dominant 7 chord here. It sounds so spooky, but then all of a sudden we realize why that's happening. We return to F major, where the C dominant 7 serves as the perfect pivot chord to land where we expect, and then we're back to the presto. Now you'll notice this time, Beethoven repeats less of the material from the presto as he did the first time, which had all of the sections repeated. But do you remember those surprises before that we mentioned in the second strain? Beethoven does this beautiful thing here where he actually removes those subito forte surprise moments. Remember them from back here? Dee da 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 dee da. Those are removed. And he changes 1 or 2 other little things, but it's so significant to me that Beethoven, again, like he did in the first movement, where he changed so many elements in the recapitulation, here, another composer might just go on autopilot and use the same music from before. Not Beethoven. By just introducing a couple of those changes and here removing a surprise, he makes us listen attentively every moment because we're expecting the next one. So if you think about it, every time he delivers us the same music, because he's established the fact that he might change it, it's still a surprise. Genius. So here we go from this moment here where we have what I'm arguing is the most beautiful music in the movement, with this darkening of color here, leading us back into our second A section. Let's hear it. Now we're back home. So again, could you hear it? Could you hear the mysteriousness here? And look at this, Beethoven. Remember we talked about again in the first lecture, he only used 4 main dynamic markings. We've seen them all so far. Piano for soft, fortissimo for the loudest, forte for just loud, and pianissimo for softest. So again, 1 P or 2 Ps. Here we have 2 Fs, and you can see, I showed us another example here, like 1 F. So it was a 4 dynamic structure. Well, look what Beethoven does here. For the first time in his symphonies, uses 3 Ps. The softest Beethoven ever has asked a musician to play. Very significant, and it's mirrored by a movement in the moment in the fourth movement, where for the first time ever, he uses 3 Fs. So let's continue. You've already heard the beginning of the presto with our familiar music, and I'll alert you as to that spot where the surprise is removed from the music. So did you remember? Previously, this music had a big crescendo and we got much louder. Now we stay soft, predicting the surprise that we're going to have here. Surprise, it didn't get louder. Second time, same thing. And now we're back to normal. That inversion we talked about before, transition music. Those markers. Da 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 da. And remember the first time where we had the first and second ending and only the second ending had the diminuendo? Here, Beethoven excises the first ending, leading us, again, we've heard all of this music before. So the idea of having it once is enough. It's already in our ear. We go immediately to the contrasting trio section, which in this case is exactly the same. The horn entry, remember this? Special. Now the horn asserts itself. Hemiola. Did you catch it? There's a repeat sign here, isn't there? Manfred Honeck, the conductor of this performance, and I agree on this. We don't take that repeat. Normally, you would never mess with Beethoven, and most people are pretty sure that Beethoven did include that repeat. But in my estimation, if he has decided to not repeat the second time through we hear the scherzo, many of those sections, it's imbalanced. It's unbalanced to repeat this section here. So many conductors will take a license in that way. And for me, it feels better to have the balance as suggested by the way you're hearing this recording. And so this is a discussion. No, there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. But in this case, when we play this symphony with the Wheeling Symphony, you'll also note that I do not take this repeat either, and nor does Maestro Honeck. So now we are in that gorgeous transitional music again that we had a nice little discussion about when we saw it the last time. Surprise note here. So now we return to the presto music, and here the music is exactly the same as the first time, except all of the repeats are taken out. But those surprises, you'll notice, in the second section are back in. Like, imagine hearing this piece for the first time, maybe you are even tonight, you've heard it once with the surprises, once without, you have no idea what's going to happen the third time through. Well, he gives the surprises back to us. Let's listen. But you could hear it both times here and here. The surprise was back in action. All right. So again, we're in that moment where the first time it was labeled as the second ending, the second time we just had it like this, diminuendo. Where are we going now? The piece should be over. We've heard A, B, A, B, A. Well, as we discussed earlier, this is the surprise. We hear the music and you'll recognize it. That sounds like we begin the trio one more time. We change it and go to this mysterious minor version. So in these bars, you can see he goes from D major, unexpectedly slips down into D minor, and then we end the movement. What fun and a nice way to end a movement that has a lot of substance for a dance movement, but really does serve as a musical joke, and thus the name Scherzo. So I hope you've enjoyed this musical journey through Beethoven's Seventh Symphony Third Movement and some of the overarching topics that we've explored together. Like I said at the beginning, there's one more of these sessions left to go. Next week, we'll explore the fourth movement. And then we are excited to see some of these new directions that Monday evenings with the Maestro will take. Thank you for being a part of this journey and for being a supporter of the Wheeling Symphony Orchestra, which is your community in concert. Thank you, and we look forward to the live question and answer session coming up in just a moment.